In the spring of 2009, a county extension dairy specialist named Glenn Stoffer stood at the fence line on the north edge of Marsh Corners in Tillman County and told Walter Boyd that the sour smell coming off his land was a public nuisance and a sign of a man who did not understand what was good for him. Walter was 61 then, and he said almost nothing back, which Glenn read as the particular stubbornness of an old man who had stopped learning. 11 years later, in the fall of 2020, a buyer from a specialty grocer in the city read a single figure off a purchase order at Walter's kitchen table and set it down like it weighed something, and the number was a verdict on everything Glenn had believed. This is the story of the 14 years between the smell and the number, and of the two kinds of knowledge that collided across one wire fence. Let me tell you about the fence first, because everything turns on it. It ran a little under half a mile along the western boundary of Walter Boyd's 80 acres, separating his ground from the Linden Dairy, a 400-cow operation that had grown up fast on the other side during the years Walter was getting older. A dairy that size makes a great deal of milk, and to make the kind of cheese it sold to the cooperative, it separated the milk into curd and a thin greenish liquid that ran off in rivers. That liquid was whey. For every pound of cheese a plant pressed, it was left with about 9 pounds of whey, and Linden made a lot of cheese. The whey was a problem. It was too rich to pour down a drain, too sour to ignore, and expensive to haul anywhere that would take it. So the dairy did what was cheapest. It ran a pipe to a holding lagoon near the property line, and when the lagoon filled, it let the overflow sheet across the low corner of its land, which drained, by the lay of the ground, straight onto Walter Boyd's pasture. For 14 years, the dairy dumped its whey at Walter's fence. And for 14 years, the credential people who came to look at it told him he was being poisoned. Walter was known in Marsh Corners for two things. He was quiet to the point that some people thought he was simple, and he understood the working of soil and animals better than any man in the county, though he never once said so. He had farmed those 80 acres for 39 years by 2009, and his father had farmed them before him, and the farmhouse had not changed in any way that mattered since the second Eisenhower term. He drove a 1971 Ford tractor, blue once and mostly rust now, that started on the third try in cold weather and ran without complaint after that. He kept 11 Tamworth hogs, a reddish heritage breed that foragers prized for the way they put on slow, firm fat, and a small herd of Jersey cows he milked by hand into a stainless pail because he liked the work and did not trust machines to be gentle. He had a dog named Pearl, a black and white border collie with one blue eye, who followed him from the barn to the fence to the house and back, and who was part of this story whether she knew it or not. When the whey first started coming in 1995, Walter did what any farmer would do. He walked the wet corner of his pasture and looked at it. The grass where the whey pooled had gone strange. Some patches died back to mud. Yet around the edges, where the whey thinned and soaked and slow, the grass came up thicker and greener than anywhere else on the place, and the clover spread, and the earthworms, when he turned a spade, were so thick the soil moved. He knelt down and crumbled a handful and smelled it, and what he smelled under the sourness was something alive. He did not have a word for it then. He had a feeling, and the feeling was that the dairy was throwing away something it did not understand. He did the only thing a careful man does with a feeling. He wrote it down. Let me tell you about the journal, because it is the real inheritance in this story, more than the 80 acres or the house. Walter's father, a man named Amos Boyd, had kept a farm ledger his whole life, and not the kind the bank wants. Amos wrote down weather and weights and what the ground did when you treated it one way or another. In a cramped hand and a series of leather-covered books he kept on a shelf above the kitchen table. He wrote down which corner of which field grew the best squash, and why he thought so. He wrote that hogs run on acorns and dropped apples cured into a firmer fat than hogs run on corn, and that the firmer fat kept longer and tasted better, and that a man who knew this and a man who did not were two different kinds of farmer. Amos died in 1981, and Walter kept the books and kept the practice, and by 2009 there were 19 of Walter's own volumes on that shelf, and the newest ones were full of whey, because Walter had started feeding it to his hogs. This is the part the experts could never see, and it is worth slowing down for. Whey is mostly water, but what is not water is no small thing. It carries the milk sugar called lactose and a set of proteins, so complete that infants grow on them, and calcium, and a scatter of other things a body uses. For most of the history of cheese-making in the old countries where the craft came from, the whey was never wasted. It went to the pigs. The pigs that drank the whey from the cheese house grew a particular kind of meat, pale and sweet and firm, and the most famous cured hams in the world, the ones that sell for more than their weight in silver, came from pigs raised exactly that way. Walter did not know the famous names. He knew his father's ledger, and he knew what he saw in his own animals. The Tamworths that drank the whey from the linden fence put on fat that was firmer and whiter and sweeter than any hog he had ever raised on grain alone, and they did it on feed that cost him nothing, because the dairy was paying to get rid of it. So while Glenn Stauffer stood at the fence in 2009 and explained that the whey was a contaminant leaching nitrogen into the water table and damaging the pasture, Walter was already 11 years into turning that contaminant into the best pork in 3 counties. The two men were looking at the same green liquid. One saw a pollution problem. The other saw the cheapest premium feed in America. Neither was lying. They simply knew 2 different things, and only one of them had been keeping a ledger. Glenn was not a bad man, that has to be said clearly, because the easy version of this story makes him a villain, and he was not one. He had a master's degree in dairy science from a good land-grant university, and he had spent 20 years helping farmers in 3 counties raise yields and pass inspections and stay solvent, and he had done real good in that time. He believed sincerely that the future of farming was bigger, cleaner, more measured, and more efficient, and that the small, diversified operation was a sentimental thing that the arithmetic of the modern world would eventually erase. When he looked at Walter Boyd, he saw a kind man falling behind, and he wanted to help. The trouble was that everything Glenn had been trained to measure missed the thing that made Walter's farm work. His instruments could read the nitrogen in the runoff. They could not read the fat on a hog. In the summer of 2010, Glenn brought a soil scientist out to the wet corner to document what he was sure was contamination, and he asked Walter to meet them there. Walter came with Pearl at his heel and stood with his hands in his pockets, while the younger man took samples in little plastic tubes. Glenn explained kindly what they would find: elevated nitrates, compromised soil structure, a pasture being slowly ruined by a neighbor's carelessness, and a landowner too proud or too tired to make them stop. "You could file on them," Glenn said, "the dairy. For the damage, I'd testify to what's here." Walter looked at the green grass at the edge of the wet ground, thicker than the grass anywhere else, and he said the first full sentence Glenn had ever heard him say. "What damage?" Walter said. It was not a question. Glenn took it for the confusion of an old man, and he said it again, slower. the way you explain a thing to someone who is not understood. He called the whey what the literature called it, a waste stream, a liability. He used the word inefficient about the whole arrangement, the small herd and the hand-milking and the hogs in the trees. And he meant it as a diagnosis and a kindness both. Walter let him finish. Then he crumbled a handful of the dark soil at the field edge, the soil thick with worms, and he held it out flat on his palm. And he said the second sentence, "This is the best ground I've got," he said. Glenn looked at the dirt and saw dirt. The soil scientist's samples came back 3 weeks later, showing exactly the elevated readings Glenn had predicted, and Glenn felt the quiet satisfaction of a man whose model has been confirmed, and he filed the results. Stay with me, because the thing about a confirmed model is that it tells you that you were right about what you measured. It does not tell you what you forgot to measure. Let me tell you what Walter was doing while the samples were being filed. He was raising 11 hogs a year on whey and forage, and he was selling them, and he had been quietly building something the county could not see. A pig, raised the way Walter raised his, takes longer than a confinement hog, 14 months instead of 6, and eats a diet no feed mill sells, and comes out lean and firm and dense in a way that the ordinary market does not pay for, because the ordinary market buys pork by the pound and grades it by fat thickness and color on a chart. Walter's pork did not fit the chart. For years he had sold it the only way he could, to a handful of families in Marsh Corners, and to one butcher 2 towns over who knew the difference and paid a little more for it. It was a living. It was not what the meat was worth. And Walter knew the meat was worth more, because his father's ledger told him what whey-fed pork had been worth in the old countries, and because his own mouth told him every time he ate it. The thing he could not do was prove it to anyone who had the money to pay for it. Proof, in the world Glenn lived in, came in numbers and certifications and lab panels. Walter had a ledger in his dead father's handwriting, and a flavor he could not put on a chart. For a long time, that was a wall he could not get over. Which brings me to Marcus. Walter had a granddaughter named Della, his daughter's girl, and Della had a husband named Marcus Reed, and in 2014 Marcus lost his job in the city, and the two of them came back to Tillman County to figure out what was next. Marcus was 28 with a business degree and 3 years at a food distribution company that had folded under him, and he arrived at Walter's farm carrying every assumption Glenn Stuffer carried, except younger and sharper and more impatient. He loved the old man. He also thought the old man was wasting 80 acres of good ground on a hobby, and he was not shy about the word. "It's a hobby, Walter," Marcus said the first autumn he was there, standing in the barn while Walter milked a Jersey by hand into a pail. "A nice one. But you're working harder than a man your age should to make less than the land would rent for. The hogs eat sewage from next door. You sell to 4 families. That's not a business. That's a man keeping busy." Walter kept milking. The streams of milk rang against the side of the pail, then went quiet as it filled. Pearl lay in the doorway with her chin on her paws. When the pail was full, Walter stood up slow, and he handed it to Marcus, warm. And he said only, "Taste the cheese before you tell me what it is." Marcus did not understand yet that this was the whole argument. Because here is the second thing Walter had been doing, the thing even his butcher did not fully know about, the thing he had taught himself out of his father's books over 14 years at the kitchen table at night. He had been making cheese. Not much, and not to sell at first. A dairy That small produces more milk in summer than two people can drink. And Walter's father had made a simple aged cheese the old way. And the method was in the ledger, and Walter had taken it up the way he took up everything, slowly and by attention. He kept his cultures alive in the cellar. He pressed his curd in a wooden hoop his grandfather had turned. He salted and turned the wheels by hand in a limestone cellar under the house, where the temperature held cool and even all year, and he let them age on plank shelves for months that ran into years. And here is the part that closes the circle, the part that makes this not two stories but one. The whey from his own cheese-making, the small rivers of it he produced in his own kitchen, went to the same hogs that drank the dairy's whey at the fence. Nothing on Walter's farm was waste. The milk became curd and whey. The curd became cheese. The whey became pork. The pork and the cheese fed the family and the few who knew the manure. From the hogs went back on the pasture, and the pasture fed the cows, and the cows made the milk. It was a closed wheel that had been turning quietly for 14 years, while the county measured the one place where a little of it spilled over a fence, and called that spill the whole truth of the farm. Marcus tasted the cheese that first autumn in the kitchen, a wheel 2 years aged that Walter cut with a wire. It was firm and golden and broke into crystalline flakes, and it tasted of grass and nuts and something deep and savory that built slowly and stayed. Marcus had eaten in good restaurants in the city. He had never eaten anything like it. He chewed for a long time and did not say anything, and Walter watched him, and the old man's face did not change, but something passed between them. "Where do you sell this?" Marcus said finally. "I don't," Walter said. "I make it for us." Marcus set down the rest of the slice and looked at the wheels on the cellar shelves, dozens of them, gold and gray with age, worth he did not yet know how much, made from milk that cost nothing extra, and aged in a cellar that cost nothing at all. And for the first time the business degree in his head went quiet and started, slowly, to do a different kind of arithmetic. The conversion of Marcus Reed did not happen in a day. Let me tell you how it actually went, because it is the truest part. He spent that winter in the cellar with Walter, and he learned how little he knew. He learned that the cheese was good not in spite of the old methods, but because of them, that the long aging on plank built the flavor the city paid for, that the cultures Walter kept alive were a strain his father had carried from the milk of those particular cows on that particular grass, and could not be bought. He learned what whey was, really, and what it did to a hog, and he stood at the fence one cold morning and looked at the green liquid sheeting down from the Linden Lagoon and understood all at once that he was looking at free feed of a quality no money could buy, and that the dairy was paying to give it away, and that his wife's grandfather had been quietly accepting that gift for 14 years, while degreed men called it pollution. Marcus laughed out loud at the fence that morning, a short, surprised laugh, and Pearl looked up at him. And that was the morning he stopped being a skeptic. What he became was useful. Marcus could not make the cheese, and he knew it, but he could do the thing Walter could not. He could translate. He understood that the world Glenn lived in did not believe a flavor, believed a document, and so Marcus set about getting documents. He had the cheese tested, not for safety, which it passed easily, but for its composition, its fat, and its long-chain flavor compounds, the chemistry that a laboratory could put on a page. He had the pork analyzed the same way. He took the numbers from his grandfather-in-law's mouth and his great-grandfather-in-law's ledger and rendered them into the language of the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet, to his quiet astonishment, agreed with the ledger down the line. Then he did one more thing. He gave the thing a name and a story, and he began carefully, to find the people who would pay what it was worth. Let me tell you about the foil now, because the story needs him to understand what was coming. Across the county road from the Linden Dairy farmed a man named Dale Kruger, who was Walter's age and had taken the opposite path with the same 40 years. Dale had borrowed and bought. He had a 1,500-cow dairy of his own by 2015, a parlor full of stainless steel, a fleet of equipment financed on 5-year notes, and a contract with a national processor that bought every gallon he could make at a price set in an office 1,000 miles away. Dale was, by every measure Glenn Stauffer used, success. His yields per cow were among the highest in the state. His operation was clean, efficient, modern, exactly the future Glenn believed in. He was also, though no one said it out loud, carrying $9 million of debt against a margin of a few cents a gallon, and his whole standing structure depended on two things staying exactly where they were. The price the processor paid had to stay up, and the cost of feed and fuel and money had to stay down. Dale was not a fool, and he was not a villain. He had done what the entire weight of expert advice had told him to do for 40 years. Get bigger or get out. Spread the fixed costs over more units, specialize, scale, and trust the market. He believed it the way Glenn believed it, because the same institutions had taught them both, and for a long time it worked, and Dale's new house and new trucks were the visible proof that it worked. And around Marsh Corners the young men looked at Dale and then at Walter and knew which one they wanted to be. Then came 2018 and the first crack. The price the processor paid for milk fell, the way it does on a cycle no farmer controls. It fell and stayed down. Dale's margin, already a few cents, went to nothing and then below nothing, and he made up the difference the only way a man in his position can, by making more milk, which meant buying more feed, which he could only afford by borrowing more, against equipment that was losing value faster than he could pay it down. Glenn came out to Dale's place that year, too, and looked at the numbers, and advised efficiencies, and the word he used at Dale's kitchen table was the same word he had used at Walter's fence 8 years before: inefficient. There were inefficiencies to be wrung out of the operation, Glenn said, gains to be made at the margin. He believed it. He was again measuring the only things his training let him measure, and the thing that was actually wrong with Dale's farm was not on the chart, because the thing that was wrong was that the whole model was rigid, and a rigid thing does not bend when the ground moves. It breaks. Walter, across the way, had no contract, no processor, no debt, and no margin to defend, because he was not competing in that market at all. He had stepped out of it before Marcus was born. He sold cheese and pork to people who came to him at a price he set, and his feed cost nothing, because it came over the fence, and his cellar held 2 years of inventory that only grew more valuable as it aged. When the milk price collapsed in 2018, it did not touch him. He noticed it the way you notice weather in a county you do not live in. This is the contrast the whole story turns on, so let me set it down plainly. To the market, Dale Kruger was a serious farmer, and Walter Boyd was a hobbyist. To the market, Dale's 1,500 cows were an asset, and Walter's 80 acres were underused. To the market, the Whey at the fence was a liability the Linden Dairy paid to dispose of. The market was confident, and the market was credentialed, and the market was about to be corrected by something it could not argue with. Which brings us to 2019 and to the structural shock that settled the question. The summer of 2019 came in hot and stayed hot, a drought that the older men compared to the bad years they had seen as boys. corn burned in the field. Hay made half a crop. The price of feed, which Dale Kruger bought by the truckload to keep 1,500 cows in milk, climbed through the spring and kept climbing through a summer when his own ground grew almost nothing. He was buying feed at the top of the market to make milk. He was selling at the bottom of it, and the gap between those two numbers was money he did not have, borrowed against equipment worth less every month. The processor squeezed itself, tightened its terms. The bank, watching the collateral fall, grew nervous. By the autumn of 2019, Dale Kruger was making more milk than he ever had and losing money on every gallon of it, and there was no efficiency left to wring because the problem had never been efficiency. The problem was that he had built a tall, rigid thing, and the ground had moved. Walter's hogs ate whey that summer the same as every summer. The drought did not raise the price of whey, because whey had no price. The Linden dairy still made cheese, still produced its rivers of the stuff, still paid to dispose of what spilled at Walter's fence, drought or no drought. While Dale bought scorched market feed by the ton, Walter's feed came free over the wire, exactly as it had for 24 years, and his pasture, the wet corner that Glenn had called damaged, stayed green through the worst of the heat because the Whey had built into that soil a depth of life and moisture that the dry months could not easily take back. The very thing the experts had measured as harm was, in the driest year in a generation, the thing that kept Walter's ground alive. Let me tell you what Whey does to soil, because this is the mechanism, and the mechanism is the reason the drought proved Walter right instead of just lucky. Whey is rich in sugars and proteins, and when it soaks into pasture in the slow thinned-out way it did pass the dead pool at Walter's fence, it feeds the microbes and the fungi in the soil, and they multiply. And as they live and die, they build organic matter, and organic matter holds water the way a sponge holds water. A soil thick with life and organic matter can hold several times the rain of a thin, dead soil, and it gives that water back to the grass slowly through a dry spell instead of letting it run off or burn away. 14 years of Whey, thinned and soaked at the edges, had turned Walter's wet corner into the most drought-proof ground in the county. Glenn's instruments had read the nitrogen and missed the water. They had measured the spill and never thought to measure the sponge. By the spring of 2020, Dale Kruger had sold his herd. It was done quietly, at auction, the cows that had been the highest yielding in the state going for less than he owed on them, the stainless parlor sitting silent, the financed equipment hauled off by men with clipboards. Glenn Stauffer was at that auction, and he did not say much. He had advised Dale for years, in good faith, with the best knowledge his profession had, and he had watched that knowledge fail in front of him, and he was not a stupid man. A stupid man can keep a model after it breaks. Glenn was not stupid. Something in him had begun, quietly and painfully, to come loose. Marcus, by 2020, had the documents and the name and the buyers. He had spent 5 years turning Walter's flavor into a thing the city could understand. He had a brand built around the closed wheel of the farm, the cheese and the whey and the hogs and the soil, the whole turning thing. And he had a story that happened to be entirely true, which is the rarest kind of marketing there is. And he had found, through patience and 100 small introductions, a buyer for a specialty grocery chain in the city, a woman named Renata Voss, whose whole job was to find foods that could not be found anywhere else. Let me tell you about Renata, because she is the qualified judge this story needed, the one person with both the palate to know what Walter had made and the authority to price it. She had spent her career in cheese. She had eaten the great cheeses of Europe in the cellars where they were made. She came to Tillman County in the early autumn of 2020, expecting, she admitted later, a pleasant rustic product she could place in a few stores as a curiosity. Marcus met her at the road and drove her in past the rusted blue Ford, past the wet green corner, down into the limestone cellar, where the wheels sat in their hundreds on the plank shelves, gold and gray, the oldest of them 4 years aged. She did not say much. In the cellar, she walked the rows. She asked Walter to cut a wheel, and he cut it with the wire, and she took a piece and held it to the light to see the crystalline flake, and she smelled it a long time, and then she ate it, standing in the cool of the cellar, with her eyes closed, and she was quiet for what Marcus said felt like a full minute. "How much of this do you have?" Renata said. Walter told her how many wheels were in the cellar and how many he made in a year. And she did the arithmetic in her head, and Marcus watched her do it, and he watched her understand that there was not nearly enough, that there could never be enough, that this was the kind of thing that existed in small quantities or not at all, and that scarcity of this particular kind was not a problem to be solved, but the very thing that made it precious. They went up to the kitchen, to the heirloom table Walter's grandfather had built from a walnut that had grown on the property, the 19 ledgers on the shelf above it, and Renata named a price. She named it for the cheese by the wheel and for a standing order. Every wheel Walter could make and age year over year, at a number per pound that Marcus had hoped for in his most optimistic spreadsheet and had not dared to expect. She wrote it on the purchase order and turned it around on the walnut table so Walter could see it, and she set her pen down on top of it, and the kitchen went quiet. The number on the page was $14 a pound. For a cheese that cost Walter, in feed almost nothing, 'cause the milk came from cows, fed on his own grass. The hogs that closed the wheel were fed on whey that came free over a fence. $14 a pound landed on that walnut table with a weight far past the digits themselves. Walter looked at it for a long moment. Pearl, gray around the muzzle, now 11 years older than the morning at the fence, lay in her place by the stove. Walter did not smile, and he did not say, "I told you so," because that was not in him. He put his hand flat on the table beside the paper, the way another man might put his hand on a Bible, and he said, "My father wrote down what this was worth in 1962. He just couldn't find anybody to believe him." It was the closest Walter Boyd ever came to a victory speech. Let me tell you what $14 a pound meant in plain numbers, because the niche of this story is arithmetic, and the arithmetic is the verdict. Walter aged out roughly 4,000 pounds of cheese a year from his small herd. At $14 a pound, on a standing order, that was $56,000 from the cheese alone, from milk that had been, by every official measure, a surplus too small to matter. The whey-fed pork, once Marcus had the story and the buyers to match it, sold into the same specialty market at prices that tripled what the butcher 2 towns over had paid. The wet corner, the damaged ground, the liability at the fence had become, across 14 quiet years, the foundation of a brand that earned more from 80 acres than Dale Kruger's 1,500 cows had earned in their best year, and it did it with no debt, no contract, no processor, and no exposure to the price that had broken his neighbor. To the bank, in 2009, Walter Boyd had been a man falling behind. To the arithmetic, by 2020, he had been right, the entire time, and quietly and alone, and with his dead father's ledger as his only ally. Glenn Stoffer came back to the farm one more time in the late autumn of 2020, after he had heard. He came on his own, not on county business, an older man now himself, near the end of a long career, and he stood again at the wet corner of the pasture, where he had stood 11 years before, and told Walter the ground was being ruined. The grass at the field edge was still green, greener than the drought-scarred ground beyond Walter's fences. Glenn looked at it a long time. "I measured the wrong things," Glenn said. "It cost him something to say it, all those years. I measured what I was trained to measure, and I missed what was in front of me." Walter did not gloat. That has to be said because the temptation of the story is to let him, and he did not. He knelt slow with his age and crumbled a handful of the dark soil, thick still with worms, and he held it out the way he had 11 years before, except this time Glenn did not see dirt. This time the man with the master's degree knelt down in his clean county clothes beside the old farmer and looked and saw. "Show me," Glenn said, "how you read it. I'd like to learn it before I'm done." And Walter Boyd, who had been called simple and stubborn and inefficient by the best credentialed men in 3 counties for the better part of 40 years, taught the county extension specialist how to read a handful of living soil, kneeling at the fence where the dairy had dumped its whey, while Pearl watched. And the late sun came low and gold across the only ground in Tillman County that had stayed green through the drought. Let me tell you how it ended, because the ending is the part that matters most, and it is not the number. Marcus and Della stayed on the farm. Marcus learned to make the cheese, slowly, at Walter's elbow, in the limestone cellar, with the cultures that could not be bought and the methods that were written in a dead man's hand. And the brand grew the way Walter wanted it to grow, which is to say only as fast as the land and the cellar could honestly sustain. They did not buy more cows than the pasture could carry. They did not take the money men offered to scale it, to franchise the story, to make the cheese in a plant, from milk that came from somewhere else. Walter had watched what scale did to Dale Kruger, and he had no intention of building a tall, rigid thing of his own. He kept it small and slow and closed and alive. The neighbors came. The young men who had once looked at Dale's new trucks and known which farmer they wanted to be came now to Walter's fence, some of them, and asked how it was done, and Walter taught them freely the way he had taught Glenn. He taught them what Whey was. He taught them that a closed wheel survives a drought that breaks an open line. He sold breeding stock from his Tamworths to 2 young families starting out, and he gave away cultures from his cellar, and he let Marcus write it all down in a form that could be shared, so that the knowledge that had nearly died on a shelf above a kitchen table became instead something that spread. And Dale Kruger, who had lost the dairy, came too, one spring afternoon across the county road. He had farmed against his neighbor on for 40 years. He did not come for cheese. He came because he did not know what to do with himself, a man whose whole identity had been hauled off on a flatbed, and Walter, who did not have a cruel bone in him, put him to work. By the next year, Dale was raising Tamworths on the lower 40, on Whey that Walter sent him from his own cheesemaking, learning at 66 the kind of farming he had spent his life being taught to despise. He was not too proud to learn it. He had watched the other way fail in front of him, and a man who has watched his model break in the open is sometimes the most teachable man there is. Here is what I have come to believe, having walked this ground and read these ledgers and sat at that walnut table. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this world, and they do not weigh the same in every season. There is the wide knowledge, the kind that scales, the kind you can teach quickly and measure cleanly and write into a contract, the kind that builds the tall, efficient things and runs them well as long as the ground stays still. And there is the narrow knowledge, the deep kind, The kind that lives in one man's attention to one piece of ground over 40 years. The kind you cannot put on a chart because the chart was built to measure something else. The wide knowledge is not wrong. It is only shallow, and shallow things are the first to dry up when the drought comes. The narrow knowledge is slow and quiet and easy to mistake for stubbornness, right up until the year the ground moves, and the deep thing is the only thing left standing. The dairy thought it was throwing away whey. It was paying every day for 14 years to hand a patient man the foundation of everything he built. The county thought it was looking at a farm falling behind. It was looking at the one operation for miles that nothing could break. What a system measures and what is truly valuable are two different things, and the gap between them is where men like Walter Boyd quietly live, and where, every so often, when the season finally turns, they are proven to have been right all along. Walter died in the spring of 2023, 85 years old, in the farmhouse that had not changed since Eisenhower, with the 19 ledgers on the shelf and the 20th, his own last one, open on the walnut table. Marcus found Pearl that morning lying against the old man's chair where she had kept her place for 14 years, and she would not be moved from it for a long while. They buried Walter on the rise above the wet corner, where the ground stayed green, and Marcus kept the cheese turning in the cellar, and kept the ledger going in his own hand, and taught his own children, when they were old enough, how to read a handful of living soil. The whey still comes over the fence, the wheel still turns, and on the rise above the greenest ground in Tillman County, under a stone with no spreadsheet on it, lies a man who knew the worth of what everyone else threw away.